Hello, my name is Michael, and I obsess. I come across something that grabs me and I consume until I can't take anymore, and then I'm on to the next. Some obsessions last a week, others a lifetime. It is my intention to explore these obsessions with you as they occur while the passion is hot. Welcome to Eclectic Obsessions. I'd ordered this through the Scholastic Book Club in 1978. When it arrived, I was in the heights of Star Wars mania and I devoured it immediately, rereading it several more times in the next few months. We will be exploring Splinter of the Mind's Eye in this episode of Eclectic Obsessions. Splinter of the Mind's Eye is a science fiction novel written by Alan Dean Foster as a sequel to the film Star Wars. Originally published in 1978 by Del Rey, a division of Ballantine Books, the book was written with the intention of being adapted as a low-budget sequel to Star Wars in the event that the original film was not successful enough to spawn the franchise it would ultimately go on to produce. Splinter of the Mind's Eye was the first full-length Star Wars novel with an original storyline to be published after the release of the original film, and is thus considered, alongside Marvel's initial comic series, to mark the beginning of the Star Wars expanded universe. Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia are on a mission for the Rebellion, but are forced to crash land on the jungle planet of Mimban. Along with C-3PO and R2-D2, they get caught up in a local woman's plans to obtain the mystical Kaiburr crystal, a force-enhancing element. A clash with mining colonists gets them incarcerated by Imperial forces. They escape, only to be chased into a labyrinth of tunnels by a giant worm creature and hairy aboriginals. Darth Vader is alerted to the presence of the two significant rebels and waits for them at the Temple of the Crystal. Leia fights with Vader with Luke's lightsaber until he rejoins them. At the book's climax, Luke severs Vader's arm, the inverse of which, Vader cutting off Luke's hand, would occur canonically in The Empire Strikes Back. Finally, Luke heals Leia's injuries with the Kaiburr crystal. The Kaiburr concept originated in the early drafts of the original Star Wars film, where it featured as a MacGuffin the Jedi needed to retrieve from the Sith. It was also the antecedent of the Kaiburr crystal, which was canonized as the power crystal used in both lightsabers and the Death Star. In 1976, Alan Dean Foster was contracted to ghostwrite a novelization for Star Wars. Foster was given some drafts of the script, rough footage, and production paintings for use as source material in fleshing out the novel. Foster's contract also required a second novel to be used as a basis for a low-budget sequel to Star Wars in case the film was not successful. Though Foster was granted a great deal of leeway in developing the story, a key requirement was that many of the props from the previous production could be reused when shooting the new film. Foster's decision to place his story on a misty jungle planet was also intended to reduce set and background costs for a film adaptation. I saw very little, Foster said. I had a couple versions of the screenplay, and they also gave me a 16mm reel of rough footage. I had also visited Industrial Light and Magic, which at the time was a rented warehouse in Van Nuys, so I had seen the trenches for Luke's flyby at the end, as well as the Millennium Falcon and the Death Star. And I had access to some of Ralph McQuarrie's production paintings, but that was it. One reason I was able to create essentially what I wanted with Splinter is because there was nothing to contradict it. Nowadays, of course, everything is vetted by committee, and if you get someone's armor wrong, someone will be right there to correct it. Since I was given complete freedom within certain limits, and the story of the first film gives you a pretty good background of the whole Star Wars universe, there was enough there that being a sci-fi writer you can fill in the blanks in certain places. Apparently, nothing directly contradicted anything that showed up in the film, or else they would have had me cut it. Nobody at the time, except perhaps George, could see Star Wars becoming what it eventually became. Han Solo and Chewbacca were also left out, as Harrison Ford had not signed a contract to film any of the sequels at the time of the novel contract. While not featured in the book, Han Solo is alluded to by Luke as a pirate and a smuggler whom he knows. An additional sequel novel was planned, but by the time Splinter was published, Star Wars had broken box office records. The film adaptation of Splinter of the Mind's Eye was abandoned in favor of Lucas's vision of a big-budget sequel. Nevertheless, riding on the success of a film in its first year of release, the book became a bestseller. The book was reprinted in 1994 as Classic Star Wars, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and retroactively placed 2 years after the original film, or 1 year before The Empire Strikes Back. The AP listed Splinter of the Mind's Eye as one of the most essential works of the Star Wars expanded universe. Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia are traveling with R2-D2 and C-3PO to the planet Circarpous 4 to persuade its inhabitants to join the Rebel Alliance. A strange energy storm forces them to crash land on the swampy Circarpous 5, known to the locals as Mimban. They begin looking for a spaceport to get off the planet, but instead find a town, near which agents of the Empire have an energy mine, the cause of the crash. Forced to keep their identities secret, Luke and Leia take refuge in a nearby bar. An old woman named Hala approaches them, identifies Luke as being strong with the Force, and shows them a splinter of what she claims to be the Kaiburr crystal, which focuses the Force. Hala strikes a deal with Luke and Leia to help her find the whole crystal, and in return she will help them get off the planet. A squabble between Luke and Leia attracts the attention of miners emerging from the pub, who claim that fighting in public is against Imperial law. They all get into a brawl. Imperial stormtroopers intervene and incarcerate Luke and Leia. They are questioned by Imperial Captain Supervisor Grammel, who confiscates the crystal shard along with Luke's weapons. Luke and Leia are placed in a maximum security cell with 2 drunk but friendly Yazim, hairy creatures called Hin and Ki. Grammel reports the incident and gives the crystal shard to the Imperial Governor of the Star System. Hala uses the Force to help Luke, Leia, and the 2 Yazim. The Yazim rampage through the jail while Luke and Leia escape. The 4 meet Hala and the droids to find the Temple of Pomojima, which Hala believes to be the location of the Kaiburr crystal. They travel through the swampy wilds of Mimban, during which they encounter a Wandrella, a huge worm-like creature which pursues them and separates Luke and Leia from the others. Luke and Leia hide in a well, down which the Wandrella falls, leaving the 2 trapped. From the lip of the well, Hala suggests there must be an escape route underground, at the end of which Hala and the others will rejoin them. Luke and Leia journey underground, floating across a lake on giant lily pads and fending off sea monsters with Luke's lightsaber. On the other side of the lake, they encounter the secretive residents of the caves, the Kowei, who have captured Hala, the droids, and the Yazim. To save his friends, Luke defeats the Kowei's champion fighter and thus impresses the tribe. At a tribal banquet, Luke senses Darth Vader. Kowei patrols discover Imperials, led by Vader and Grammel, are approaching. When the Imperials arrive, they are surprised by the Kowei tribe's resistance in battle. Vader and Grammel retreat with a handful of surviving stormtroopers, though Vader loses patience with Grammel for the defeat and kills him. Luke and company steal a recently abandoned Imperial transport and travel to the temple, where they find the Kaiburr crystal. They encounter a monster and unsuccessfully try to fight it off with blasters. Luke cuts down one of the pillars holding up the temple, crushing the monster, but Luke's leg is pinned under a boulder. Vader then enters the temple, announcing that he's killed Hin and Ki. Leia takes up Luke's lightsaber and begins fighting Vader, who gives her multiple superficial burns with his own saber. Hin, mortally wounded, shows up and lifts the rock off of Luke before perishing. Luke fights Vader, showing more skill than expected, deflecting some Force-based attacks and eventually slicing off Vader's arm. Despite this, the Sith Lord seems about to win, but then falls into a pit. Luke senses that this is not the end of Vader. He and Leia, healed by the crystal, drive off with Hala into the mists of Mimban. There are minor inconsistencies between this novel and the one existing film, as Foster didn't know explicitly how the events of the original film played out before writing the adaptation. In the novel, the blade of Darth Vader's lightsaber is described as blue, like Luke's, although this may be due to the bland coloration of the lightsabers in the original theatrical release of Star Wars. The lightsaber helped define the Star Wars saga and set it apart from the rest of the world of science fiction, yet at the time of writing Splinter of the Mind's Eye, the properties of the weapon were far from established. Audiences grew to learn that the saber was nothing more than a sword made of energy, yet in Splinter the weapon was somehow capable of picking locks thanks to Luke. At another point in the novel, Luke connects his lightsaber to an Imperial blaster, seemingly to charge the weapon to its full strength. Fans would eventually learn that the Kaiburr crystals provided the weapons with their power, but in this novel, the Kaiburr crystal amplified one's Force abilities. R2-D2 is referred to in the novel as a D2 unit, despite the film clearly establishing R2 unit as the standard nomenclature. In the novel, Vader says that he had a difficult time discovering that Luke shot up his TIE fighter. In the film, the Millennium Falcon, piloted by Han Solo, had shot at one of Vader's wingmen, and Vader's other wingman was so startled by this unexpected attack that he veered into Vader's TIE, sending it spinning away from the Death Star. At the time this book was written, story elements revealed in later films had not yet been established. For example, the sibling relationship between Luke and Leia had yet to be decided, but the characters themselves would have been unaware of their relationship at this point in their lives, which explains the presence of some sexual tension between them. The credibility of Leia's claim on Endor that she had always known Luke was her brother is undermined by the decidedly unbrotherly kiss she bestows to him on Hoth. Although Lucas claimed to have had the Star Wars saga mapped out even at this early stage, the fact that he allowed this plot element to remain in Foster's novel has been cited as evidence that he hadn't yet decided on the character's backstory. However, Lucas has stated that this tension was intentional, to show that the two had feelings for one another, but they did not know exactly what type of feelings. At the time, Foster said, the indications in the vibe I got from the first film was that they were not siblings and that Luke was interested in her, and she was, casually perhaps, interested in him. And you actually get that feeling partway through The Empire Strikes Back, too. A deleted scene from the film depicts an almost kiss between Luke and Leia that's more in line with their relationship as it exists in the book. The movie kicked off with Leia being a prisoner, yet still managed to display her courage in the face of danger. Luke was a farm boy who was only beginning to demonstrate his abilities with the Force, while his piloting abilities were hard to dispute. In Splinter, Leia is virtually reduced to being the typical damsel in distress stereotype, regularly being defeated by any foe she comes into contact with. Luke, on the other hand, is much more powerful in the ways of the Force and more skilled with the lightsaber, even managing to overpower Vader and amputate his robotic arm. Empire Strikes Back offered many more powerful moments for Leia and showed Luke's struggle with the ways of the Jedi, whereas Splinter expedites Luke's training efforts and puts Leia's bravery on the back burner. During the Mimban duel, Luke tells Vader, "I am Obi-Wan," which could indicate that Luke's prowess against the far more powerful and experienced Vader was a result of Obi-Wan's Force spirit flowing through Luke during the duel. This is also supported by Obi-Wan's claim in The Empire Strikes Back that he can no longer interfere, which implies that he once had helped Luke in battle. Leia's ability to hold off Vader without any Jedi training can be explained by the revelation in Return of the Jedi that she was Force-sensitive and a potential Jedi. There's been a lot of discussions recently about the extent of Force abilities thanks to The Last Jedi, with Splinter featuring one of the more fascinating manifestations of the power, Obi-Wan's presence empowering Luke. In many chapters in the Star Wars saga, fallen Jedi have been able to visually appear to their allies. Yet with Splinter, Kenobi also lent his former physical abilities to Luke, pushing his lightsaber abilities farther than what Luke had previously demonstrated. In the novel, C-3PO mentions that Darth Vader knows all the proper code words and commands to shut him down. This eventually received an explanation, as it was revealed in The Phantom Menace that Vader himself, as a young Anakin Skywalker, built 3PO. However, Revenge of the Sith brings this explanation into question when Bail Organa orders C-3PO's mind wiped. Whether Lucas had developed any of these story elements at this early stage is not likely. There are a vast amount of differences between the events of Splinter of the Mind's Eye and Empire Strikes Back, but one of the surprising elements is how the novel touches upon familiar plot points and characters, yet features slight variations on their names, appearances, or character traits. The planet Mimban is considered to be a swampy, fog-covered planet, much like Dagobah. Hala helps Luke embrace his inner abilities and pushes him to accomplish feats he believes are outside of his skill set, much like Yoda. The story even involves a scene in which the characters unknowingly drive a speeder over the back of a massive creature, not realizing that the creature has awoken and begins to destroy their ride. This feels incredibly similar to Han parking the Millennium Falcon inside the mouth of the immense space slug. The similarities even continued up through The Force Awakens, with Rey taking the lightsaber from Finn to finish a duel with Kylo Ren. In Splinter, Leia takes Luke's weapon to confront Vader in the middle of a desolate woods, evoking visual similarities between the encounters. Splinter of the Mind's Eye was adapted into a Dark Horse comic book limited series and graphic novel by Terry Austin and Chris Sprouse, published in 1996. The book has the Star Wars Corporation listed as a copyright holder. Reflecting on Splinter of the Mind's Eye decades later, Foster said, "Other than the fact that it's still in print and people still regard it as a good read, and in spite of the contradictions with subsequent films, I'm pleased that I was able to create an entire world on my own, with its own society and set of imperial villains, and they all still hold up. I like to think that's a credit to the writing and the fact that I was true to the universe and the character and the situation. The book exists on its own terms, because there's nothing that follows it directly. There's no reason to mess with it and make it into something it's not. I thought for many years that it would have made a marvelous made-for-TV movie. It could have been filmed cheaply and then you stick it between episode 4 and 5. And in an alternate universe, maybe it was."
I will tell you the story behind Splinter of the Mind's Eye and how it came to be. It's a short story. A long time ago, in a city not so far away, a fellow named George Lucas was trying to make a science fiction film that everybody was convinced would be a complete flop. While the film was in production, he thought that it would be a good idea to have something come out before the film came out to kind of prepare the ground for people who had no idea what Star Wars was. It was called The Star Wars, by the way, at the time. But this was while the film was still well into production. And George wanted a book version of the film to come out, a novelization, and also wanted some kind of a sequel to come out, so that if the film did prove moderately successful, there would be more material for people before he could make, say, a second film, which he always had in mind. So George needed somebody to write the book version of the film and a sequel book. When the word went out, Del Rey Valentine bought the rights. What happens when a publisher buys the rights to do a book version of a movie is the publisher then goes and picks a writer to do the work. The writer is then presented to the film company, the production company, whoever's selling the rights, and based on their approval, the writer is then given a copy of the screenplay and is then sent to write the book. But George wanted both a novelization of the film and a sequel book. So it was a 2-book contract. I was contacted, my publisher proposed me as the writer, and I then went to meet with Tom Pollock, who later became either vice president or president of Universal Studios, but at that time was George Lucas's lawyer. He was an entertainment lawyer working out of an office on Sunset Boulevard. I apparently passed that brief interview. He said, "Okay, we'd like you to go meet with George. If you're okay with George, then we'll give you the contract and go to work. So I was sent out to Industrial Light and Magic, which is a name you probably are all familiar with by now. Well, at that time, Industrial Light and Magic, instead of being a giant of the special effects industry, occupied a rented warehouse on Kester Avenue in Van Nuys, which is in the San Fernando Valley, and by sheer coincidence was about a 6-minute drive from where I grew up. So I knew the street. I didn't know the building, but I knew exactly where it was. So I went out there on one nice sunny day. So George comes out and we shake hands, and, how are you? And he's obviously fairly preoccupied because he's trying to finish this film before he runs out of money. And anyway, I was given the job. So I wrote the screenplay, and as I'm writing, I wrote the book, and as I'm writing the book, I'm going through the screenplay, and I'm thinking, he can't afford to put this on screen this way. He can't afford to put this on screen this way. And then I started in on Splinter, and I had no guidelines for Splinter. I said, well, what do you want in your sequel novel, George? And he said, I don't care, do anything you want involving the characters and the story that I've set up, the background that I've set up. He said, you can do anything you want. Basically, he didn't have time to mess with it anyway. So I had complete freedom to write the book, with one exception. He said, you can't use the character of Han Solo, because at that time, Harrison Ford had not yet signed on for any sequels, or for the use of his likeness, or anything else to do with Star Wars. So that's why Han Solo does not appear in Splinter from Mind's Eye. It's also why Ralph McQuarrie painted the cover this way. It turned out to be an extraordinarily dramatic and successful cover. But there was a specific reason he had to paint it this way. Not only had Harrison Ford not signed on for the use of his likeness, neither had Mark Hamill or Carrie Fisher. So their characters, Luke and Leia, are both in the book, obviously, but he couldn't show their faces. Now, he could have painted other faces onto the characters, but obviously that's not what you want with a sequel to a movie. So that's why he painted the two characters from behind. Darth Vader, of course, doesn't have that problem. So that's why the cover painting appeared that way. So, having completed the novelization, which George was very happy with, and which includes some things which are not in the original cut of the film, of course, I went home, went back to work on the book, on the sequel novel. The only stricture that George put on it was, he said, I want you to write a book that can be filmed on a low budget. Because he had the idea, always thinking ahead, that if Star Wars made a little money, but not a lot of money, then he could make a cheap sequel using existing props and backgrounds and costumes. That's why I set the whole thing on a fog-shrouded planet. It reduces your need for expensive backgrounds. I finished the book, and I went to a meeting at Universal. The film is still in production, remember. And I had a meeting with George and Gary Kurtz, who was the producer, and a man named Charlie Lippincott, who was the director of publicity for the upcoming film. We discussed the book very briefly because the three of them were busy with the movie. And George said, I really like the book, I'm very happy with the book, but I want you to please take out the first chapter. The first chapter, for those of you who've read the book, was originally a fairly complex battle in space, which is what forces Luke and Leia down onto this planet. And the reason George had me take it out had nothing to do with the way it was written. It would have been very expensive to film. It could have stayed in the book. It didn't cost anything to put it in the book. But if he ever got around to filming it, it would have been costly to shoot. So I cut that out. And that was about it. Everything else stayed, which didn't matter. It was fine at the time. However, in light of subsequent films, there are some interesting things from the book that people have remarked upon and also said about it. Subsequent to the release of the film, George made a little money, and he didn't have to do a second film on a low budget. He was able to do exactly what he wanted, and he did Empire Strikes Back, and of course Return of the Jedi, and here we are, 40 years later. There is a certain frisson between Luke and Leia in the book that doesn't exist between the characters in the rest of it. At the time I wrote the book, remember I was given no guidance. I was just said, go home and write a novel. And George approved it. He liked it. This tells us that George had not decided at this point that Luke and Leia were to be brother and sister. And it's not just me in the book. So there's a little flirtation. I had the impression from watching Star Wars, and before that, because I hadn't seen the film before I wrote the novelization or Splinter, that they were love interests. I had no idea that they were siblings. There's the famous scene in the film where, the princess gives him a kiss for luck before they swing across the open trench. That wasn't a very sisterly kiss. And there is a cut shot. For those of you who love to research these things, it's available online. There's a cut scene from Empire Strikes Back. So this goes on through at least the second film, where there's a rather steamy, embrace scene between Luke and Leia in The Empire Strikes Back, which George cut out because at that point he had decided to. It's just stuff gets made up as it goes along. It's very difficult to write sequels. You're always thinking while you're writing a sequel, well, everybody knows these characters. How am I going to get them interested in another book about the same characters? It's a problem every writer has had. It's why A. Conan Doyle tried to kill off Sherlock Holmes. Prequels are even more difficult. But sequels are tough also. And a very difficult thing to pull off.
I have always loved this book. I still love this book. Although the canon swung wildly away from it, I always held a special place for it in my heart. I highly suggest you read it, as it provides a unique and early glimpse to alternate storylines it might have been. I have been obsessed with it for years. Thank you for listening to Eclectic Obsessions. If you like what you've heard, please download past episodes and subscribe on iTunes for future releases. You can follow the show on Facebook at Eclectic Obsessions, on Twitter at Eclectic Obsess1, on Instagram at Eclectic Obsessions Podcast, and on YouTube at Eclectic Obsessions. I'd love to hear what you think. Feel free to email the show at ecobpod@gmail.com. We'll be back in 1 month's time with a new Eclectic Obsession.